So in the second part of this video on adding the interior lighting, just going to change the intensity of the OmniLight we had put in, both OmniLights, so they're brighter, and look at some exposure control settings. So the first thing in my Modify panel, I'm changing the multiplier to 60. Pretty high. Both OmniLights are at 60 now, and you just have to work with this number to get one that looks right for your scene. I can see the preview in the viewport, so I know the light's active and turned on. Sometimes when you have a lot of lights, you don't want to see this preview, so I right-click over the word Perspective there and click on Configure. And under the rendering method, I'm turning on the default lighting, just checking that checkbox. And all that does, it turns the default lighting on, which turns off any of your scene lights. This doesn't affect the render at all. It's just a good thing to know, because sometimes you just can't see your objects very well when your light is just too bright. So I'm going to turn that back off so that I can see the preview. So this tells me my OmniLight is working. So I'm ready to do a test render. So I'm just going to click on the teapot there, upper right corner of the screen, and do a test render. So my daylight system from the previous video is pretty dark because it's more of a nighttime scene right now. Notice I have a problem though. Those two OmniLights aren't showing, so the lighting just isn't in there. I know the position of the lights is good, so that tells me it's probably the exposure control settings. So since that light's not showing, but my daylight system is, I'm going to go back up under my rendering menu and go under Environment. And before we were using the MR photographic exposure control, and we just had the daylight system in there, so we had based it on a physically based lighting, outdoor, daylight, clear sky setting. So the preset had set it. One problem with that preset is that it doesn't show the interior lights. I'm just going to change this over to a non-physically based lighting preset, just so you can see the difference here. Notice how bright that is now. Exposure is just completely off. So those presets really make a huge difference. One preset, or just one type of exposure control that works out well with both the daylight system and an interior light, is your logarithmic exposure control. So I'm going back here in my environment setting, changing that over to the logarithmic exposure control, and then turning on exterior daylight, the little checkbox there. This is a good setting or a good type of exposure control when you have the exterior daylight system and you also have interior lights that you're turning on. So now I'll do another render. And now I'm seeing the lights inside the building, getting some nice reflections out on the site. And there's still a lot of materials and stuff we need to add to the scene. But now I know my lights are working. I'm going to move those lights down a little bit so they shine out a little more. Kind of tricky to select them, so I'm hitting H on my keyboard, double-clicking on them in the list there, and then that way I can easily move them down. Just want them a little lower so I can see them a little better. And there's a lot of settings in the Modify panel that you can change. Now to do a test render with a little more detail, I'm going to turn on Final Gather again. So I can hit F10, Indirect Illumination, enable Final Gather, doing the 2 bounces. It'll get me back to where we were in previous videos, where it just is a nicer render. And that'll be a good render to test out these lights. Now in the next video we're going to animate those interior lights, so as the sunlight goes down, the daylight system moves down, it starts getting dark, we're going to animate those interior lights to turn on. So I'm at a good starting point here. I can do a lot of different settings here. But this would be good just for a quick test render here of what it'll look like with interior lights. So in our next video we'll animate that interior light, both of those mental ray OmniLights.